Welcome to our presentation, Work Sample Testing, a pre-employment screening technique that works. This presentation is brought to you by Group 4, which consists of Brian McRory, Denise Blackburn, Sean Walls, Evan Kirkpatrick, and Shilia Santiago. Our goal is to educate about the use of work sample tests, how they are organized, what they are used for, and provide data from important studies into the effectiveness of work sample testing. The use of work sample testing is increasing as companies find it more difficult to differentiate suitable candidates during the interview process. Work sample testing provides an additional level of evaluation and allows for managers to identify the most qualified candidates for a position. Work sample tests are defined as psychological testing techniques used in employee selection to assess an individual's ability to learn the required skills and to perform the tasks associated with a particular job. They are also known as a trainability test or job simulation. In other words, an individual is placed in a real-life situation where their performance can be monitored. This allows managers to gain an understanding of potential ability prior to a candidate being hired. Work sample testing has been around since the 60s, and its use remained steady for more than 20 years until the 90s when personality testing became the preferred method of applicant screening. This was due in part to the dot-com boom, which created an environment in which there was a lack of qualified candidates. With talent at a premium, companies were willing to hire anyone who was qualified and did not see an added benefit of providing these types of tests. With the current economic climate creating a wave of applicants for companies, many decided to return to the practice of using work sample tests to identify the most compatible candidates within a large pool of qualified applicants. The rise of these tests has been most notable in industries such as manufacturing, sales, healthcare, and call centers where the rate of success for new hires can be more easily identified by use of job simulation during the selection process. Work sample testing is the primary reason for approximately 30 to 40% of applicants who do not get hired. Employers feel that by utilizing a more in-depth screening process, they will save money over the long term. However, work sample testing can be expensive, with costs ranging from $50 per test for entry-level positions to over $7,000 for executive simulations. This is in addition to setup fees that can range from $10,000 to $30,000. Some companies have even invested hundreds of thousands of dollars to construct centers for workplace testing and job simulation. The reason companies are willing to invest this amount of money for testing is to reduce the amount underachieving employees cost them. While it is a difficult task to accurately identify just how much underperforming employees cost an organization, a 2004 study conducted by the Future Foundation with SHL found that the cost of underachievement in the U.S. alone was $153 billion. While $7,000 for an individual assessment may seem like a lot, it makes more sense when you consider that the personnel being considered for these positions are often going to be highly compensated and will have significant impact on success of the organization. For these reasons, companies cannot afford to fail during the selection process.
The testing technique of work sample test is based on the concept that the best predictor of future behavior is to observe behavior under similar situations. These tests require the individual taking the test to perform tasks that are similar to those that would be required to be performed as part of the job. A common question for anyone looking into work sample test would be, what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of using this type of test? First, let's look at some of the advantages for using a work sample test in a selection process. Work sample tests offer high reliability due to the nature of the test and the consistency of the results measurements. For example, if the same individual was asked to perform the test on more than one occasion, similar results would be expected to be achieved. Work sample tests are associated with having a high content validity, since the test is a sample of the actual work performed on the job. The test results have demonstrated to produce valid inferences regarding an applicant's ability to perform the job. The test results possess some degree of probability relative to the premises of the job description and requirements. The test results can be used to provide specific developmental feedback, especially for the review of current employees in the identification of how to improve their job performance. The results can reveal additional information about candidates that did not come up in other hiring tools. For example, this type of test can provide the evaluator with insight on the applicant's ability to learn new skills or handle certain situations. Another positive aspect of work sample tests is due to the obvious relationship to the job. These tests are typically viewed more favorable by applicants than aptitude or personality tests. Work sample tests are perceived by applicants as being fair, acceptable, and appropriate based on the job the applicants applied to. These tests are often associated with being less biased, provided the written and verbal content is at the level required in the job. Work sample tests are also less likely to differ in results by gender or race in comparison to other types of tests. Still, others prefer using work sample tests as it is difficult for applicants to fake job proficiency. This helps to increase the relationship between scores on the test and performance on the job. It also helps in reducing the likelihood of poor hiring decisions, as organizations will select the most qualified candidate for this specific position. In hiring the best candidate for a position, there is a reduction in the expense associated with employee turnover. In regards to work sample tests being a real-life example of what will be expected of the applicants, the tests use equipment that is the same or substantially similar to the actual equipment used on the job. This helps the evaluators identify employees and applicants that need more training. This type of testing technique provides test takers with a realistic preview of the job and the organization. It assists the applicants in identifying what is actually required of them if they were to be the one to fill this job position. Although there are many advantages to this type of testing technique, there are also quite a few disadvantages. The first we should look at is the expense. As Brian had outlined earlier in the presentation, there is an expense to these tests that could be significant to smaller organizations. There is the expense and time consumption to develop an effective test that will produce the desired results of identifying the best candidate. In order to design this type of test, a thorough job analysis may need to be conducted, which will consume more time and money. There is also the expense of administering the test. As mentioned as an advantage, the test is conducted using actual or similar equipment to what would be used on the job. There is often an expense with utilizing this type of equipment, especially when there will be no useful output or product produced from the test. Another key disadvantage to this type of testing is that it is not conducive to group administration and often can only be administered to one applicant at a time. Although this technique is often considered a useful tool where tasks and duties can be completed in a short period of time. These tests have less ability to predict performance on jobs where tasks may take days or weeks to complete. This results in a limited assessment of applicants and does not assess aptitude to perform more complex tasks that may be encountered on the job. It also may not assess the test taker's ability to learn new tasks quickly. A work sample test is usually less able to measure aptitudes of an applicant, thus restricting the test to measuring ability to perform the work sample, and not more difficult tasks that may be encountered on the job. It is only testing the applicant's ability to carry out a test in the test environment, but does not predict whether they will have the motivation or personal aptitude to carry that task reliability on the job. Work sample tests may require some level of job knowledge and therefore may not be appropriate for jobs where knowledge may be obtained via a short training period. This can put those applicants with no direct experience at a disadvantage. For example, if the job requires the use of a specific piece of equipment that each employee goes through a specific training process for, and is specific to the position, then applicants most likely cannot be expected to know how to operate the machine. This would prevent this piece of equipment from being incorporated into the work sample test. Some people have difficulty taking tests in general, and just the idea of taking a test can be very intimidating to potential candidates. A final disadvantage to mention is the lack of diversity the test provides. If all the applicants have the same skills, abilities, and traits. Although there are some disadvantages to work sample tests, many companies have found success in using this method. Let's look at some helpful tips for making a work sample test a successful tool for your company. Job analysis is critical for identifying the content of the job for which samples will be developed. The critical incident technique would be helpful for identifying job duties and tasks that, if sampled on the test, would result in high predictive validity. High content validity is also extremely important to the success of the test. These tests should be constructed with the intent of developing a highly content valid test. The content validity should be built into the test. As mentioned before, equipment is usually a key piece to work sample tests. If specific equipment is used by incumbents on the job, try to incorporate all or some of that equipment on the test. Of course, the safety of the applicants should take precedence over use of dangerous or unfamiliar tools or machines. Now let's look at some specific tips in considering when designing and administering work sample tests. These tips will aid in the success of your test. First, tests should be designed for results to easily compare the different candidates. Second, it is important that the tests are made up of tasks that are directly related to the job. Third, the evaluators need to be knowledgeable of the expectations for the position, as well as the relationship between the position and the work sample test. Fourth, it is important to make sure the test is designed to identify the most ideal candidate to get the highest return on investment. It is very important to measure competencies that are highly critical for successful performance on the job. Finally, ensure the test is administered to only a small group of prospective candidates to assist the evaluator in best evaluating the candidate and assisting in the comparison of the results. When the determination is made that a work sample test is the evaluating technique that will be used, the designers and administrators should have some specific goals in mind. First is to benefit from the advantages a screening test like this can provide. For example, how relatable to the test is the expectations from the job requirements. Another goal should be to decrease the impact of any disadvantages associated with the test. For example, ensure that applicants have the required knowledge and skills for taking the test, and add as much diversity in the test as possible. A third goal is to get the highest return on investment. There can be a large expense incurred in the development and administration of these tests, so it is most beneficial to design tests that will produce the best overall candidate for the position. It can be worth the upfront expense to find the ideal candidate for the position that will stay and grow in the position rather than having continuous turnover.
Now that we've looked at the pros and the cons, the advantages and disadvantages of work sample tests, let's take a look at some of the types of work sample tests that you can administer. We're going to look at 4 different types that are common in the workplace today. The first one is a test of trainability, which looks at the candidate's ability to learn in new situations and adapt to any given environment. The second is a simulation of events, where a candidate is presented with a picture of a real work type of event and are given various questions to answer on how they would react to that particular situation. The third are low fidelity type simulations, where it's very similar to a simulation of an event, but there are no visual cues. It's just a written description and a multiple choice type of answer. And the final type of test is a work sample, which is more or less a simulation of real work events. Let's take a look at each one of these in turn. The first type of work sample test that we're going to take a look at is one that focuses on trainability. The purpose of this type of test is to see how quickly an individual can learn and adapt to a new environment, how quickly they can develop new skills, and it's really best when it's administered to someone with no previous experience. The way that these are conducted is a simple set of instructions are given to the individual, and then you ask them to do something, and you measure how quickly they learn and how well they carry out the instructions that you've given them. The one major drawback with this particular type of test is that there is a very low predictive validity rate with them. In other words, the fact that someone did poorly on a test of trainability does not necessarily equate to them doing poorly in a real work scenario or real life situation. I think Bill Gates said it best when he was quoted as saying that his friend in school passed all the tests and did better than him in all of the subjects. But today, that person is an engineer, and Bill Gates is the owner of the company. Let's take a look at the next one. The second type of work sample test that we're going to take a look at are simulations of events. This is not an acting out, but rather a situation where a candidate is presented with a picture of a potential work situation or incident, and in this picture, each of the persons depicted in the picture have captions above their head, kind of giving context as to what's going on in the situation. The candidate is then given a series of questions on how they would act or respond in this particular situation. They then write down their answers, and these answers are evaluated by a subject matter expert. It allows the employer to get some insight into the candidate's reasoning, their logic, their understanding of a particular situation, and the way that they would respond in a potential real work environment. The third type of work sample tests that we're going to look at are low fidelity simulations. These are very similar to the previous one we just looked at. However, the big differentiator is that there are no visual cues or pictures to depict the situation. Rather, the person is given a written text that describes a particular scenario or situation in the workplace and given 5 answers or 5 choices to choose from. The candidate then chooses a response, and the responses are measured against the right answers. The fourth and final type of work sample tests that we're going to look at are called just that, work samples. These are really scenarios or simulations of an actual work environment where the person or the candidate is asked to perform a specific job-related task. This is something that we leverage in my field quite often, and I'm in IT. When we ask somebody to come in and sit in a lab environment and ask them to configure something, a router or a switch or a firewall, and this is a really good way to test somebody's alleged ability or claimed proficiency in any particular area. There are, however, some significant drawbacks to this particular approach, and the first one is that it's not feasible for all environments. Unless you have a lab or a simulated sort of work environment, it's difficult to carry out. It's also difficult when it comes to dangerous or complex work environments. The second thing that is a drawback to this particular type of sample test is that it can't be administered easily for groups. So it's usually on a one-on-one basis. So now we've looked at the types of tests that you could choose from if you wanted to administer a work sample test in the selection of your candidate. Now what we need to do is figure out, are these tests useful? Are they accurate? In order to do that, we determine how valid the test is and how valid the actual measurements of these tests are. We're going to take a look at those right now. Now the first thing we want to look at is the content of the test itself. We want to measure what's called content validity. We want to ensure that the tasks that were asked on the actual test itself have a strong and direct relationship with the actual job that the candidate might do in the future. We want to compare these tasks to the job, and not just compare them, but we want to make sure that they encompass significant tasks or duties that this person may be asked to do in the future. We don't want to have small, unimportant tasks that the person might be asked to do. For example, if I was hiring a firewall engineer, I would want to make sure that they were able to configure firewall rule sets and do base configs on an actual firewall. I'm not so concerned whether they can turn a key to get into the lab, even though that may be part of their job down the road. I want to make sure that they can do the core tasks that are required of that person on the job. Now the final area that we want to explore when determining validity of an actual work sample test is criterion validity. And what that really means is, what are we going to measure and how are we going to measure it? It boils down to criteria used and predictor measures that are used. So now we've administered the test and we want to measure the success or failure of an individual. What we need to do is understand the criteria that we're going to use. There's 2 different ways to do this that are most common in the workplace, and that's supervisor rating and production measures. Supervisor rating basically allows the person who administers this or the future supervisor of the individual to measure the success or proficiency of an individual on a particular test. there's some significant drawbacks to this particular approach, and it really boils down to bias. It's been proven that supervisor ratings have very weak statistical significance, and that bias such as the halo effect, the leniency effect, can creep in there and actually cause some issues with the actual rate of these tests. The second thing is production measures. And this is a bit more quantifiable in the fact that we can measure the quantity or the quality of somebody's work. Big drawback with this particular approach is the fact that not all types of jobs can be measured in this way. Not all jobs are producing something of a particular quality or whatnot. So there's drawbacks to both of these approaches. But either way, you need to decide on what criteria you're going to use in order to make success of a work sample test. The final thing we're going to look at in my section of the presentation is predictor measures. And you might be saying, what is this? This is really what we're going to measure in order to determine whether someone is successful or unsuccessful on a work sample test. There are three different approaches that are commonly used in the workforce at this point, and they include the number of samples completed, and what normally this entails is setting a time limit on the actual test and determining how many of the tasks that were asked to be completed were done. There may be a threshold that determines success or failure, and if the person exceeds that and produces more or completes more answers or more tasks in that time frame, then they were successful. But it may vary depending on the type of situation or test that's being implemented. The second is the time it takes to complete a sample. So it may not be a number that you're completing or a certain number of tasks that you're completing, but one task and how long it takes you to do it. And the threshold may be at a certain amount of time. If you go past that, then your productivity is low and you're considered unsuccessful in that particular test. And the final thing would be number of errors. And this would be in an environment where mistakes or errors are not tolerated. So if a person exceeds a certain number of errors in the particular task that they're asked to do, they may be considered unsuccessful. Now we've looked at the types of work sample tests that you can administer, how you go about making those valid by making sure that the criteria that you're looking at closely mirrors what's going to be done in the workplace. We've looked at how to measure success and failure. Now let's take a look at a couple of case studies that will add some validity to what we've already been discussing.
As an example, we looked into a case study that used work sample tests in predicting employee performance. The ability to troubleshoot electrical equipment has become increasingly important as the Navy has come to rely more and more on radio, radar, and other electronic equipment. Arthur Siegel and John Jensen wanted to assist the Navy in accurately predicting employees' abilities to respond in real-life troubleshooting situations. They wanted to build a job sample troubleshooting performance battery called the AE Troubleshooting Performance Examination and a written test to predict the job sample performance. To comprise the most accurate test as possible, Siegel and Jensen limited their population of their study to aviation electricians. Siegel and Jensen determined that there were 4 different aspects of troubleshooting that needed to be tested in order to predict future performance. They wanted to test the user's abilities to formulate hypotheses as to the cause of the malfunction on different naval ships, perform actual electrical checks and equipment performance checks in order to substantiate or reject the hypotheses they came up with, diagnose the cause of the malfunction in the electrical and equipment performance checks with their predetermined hypotheses, and perform the actual work required for elimination of the cause of the discrepancy. 4 separate tests were constructed to measure the electrician's abilities in one of these 4 logical areas. These tests were administered over a 3-month period in 5 different electrical shop maintenance logs before compiling their results. The composite performance score of an individual was obtained by adding each of their scores on the individual subtest. Electricians were rated into 4 separate categories ranging from most efficient to least efficient in troubleshooting. These categories were listed as first class, second class, third class, and fourth class. Siegel and Jensen concluded that the data compiled was useful in helping to gain insight into the troubleshooting behaviors of those tested. They found that people in higher rates, such as first class and second class, were found to be superior to those in the lower rates in the ability to troubleshoot. They also concluded that the additional training of someone from the third or fourth class might help them move upward into a higher class if the tests were administered again post-training. Lastly, the Navy was able to use this testing as an entrance exam, ongoing measure of performance and ability.
One issue that has been brought up over the years in regards to work sample tests is whether there is a difference between using trained people and untrained people in tests. Up until the 1960s, when Sylvia Downs started looking into this matter, the studies mainly focused on people who were already trained for the job. It did not account for people who may not have had any training for the position. This is especially relevant, even still today, for entry-level positions where recent graduates or others may not have had training in the subject. After Downs started this trend, the focus of studies shifted to people who were not trained for the job. This continued all the way up until the 1980s. Sylvia Downs and Ivan Robertson decided in 1989 to perform a meta-analysis. This is the combining and analysis of results from different studies. This became one of the more notable studies on the subject to date. It was called Work Sample Tests of Trainability, a Meta-Analysis. This was published in the Journal of Applied Psychology in 1989. Next, we will look at their method. Robertson and Downs conducted their meta-analysis through a literature search where they identified valid studies that used work sample trainability tests. The trainability tests that Robertson and Downs were interested in covering had 3 very distinct features. 1, they had to use a work sample. Next, they had to contain a period of instruction where the person learned various tasks. Finally, they had to be suitable for untrained people with no experience. Robertson and Downs decided to keep any study that had a defined sample, validity coefficient, which is the correlation between 2 items being compared, type of predictor, such as an error score or an assessor's rating, type of criteria, such as a test or performance rating, and length of a follow-up period were all used. Once Robertson and Downs had this data, they analyzed it by determining the average validity coefficient. Through the process, they of course accounted for sampling error. They also ran into another issue. Many studies they looked at contained multiple validity coefficients. For instance, some studies looked at both error scores and ratings during the course of their studies. Robertson and Downs needed to just look at one per study. When this was the case, they essentially ranked the different coefficients. First, they looked at length of follow-up period. They preferred longer follow-up periods. Next, they looked at sample size. The larger the sample size, the better. Finally, if sample sizes and follow-up times were identical, the average coefficient was calculated and used with both of the sample sizes. Now, we will look at the results they found during the course of their study. Robertson and Downs came to a number of conclusions following their literature search and meta-analysis. What they found was that most coefficients were from studies involving trainability test scores and not job performance. So, they were able to find a correlation between trainability tests and test performance, but not necessarily trainability tests and job performance. They also found that the highest average validity coefficient, 0.48, was for error scores as the predictor, and training success as the criteria. In essence, the more training success they had, the better their error scores were. In terms of job performance, coefficients and variation were much smaller. The data led Robertson and Downs to conclude that work sample trainability tests are better at predicting measures of training success than measures of job performance. Finally, the results showed that work sample tests are better at predicting short-term training success than long-term training success. However, there was higher variability when short-term follow-up periods were used.
As we have just seen, work sample tests are often used in pre-employment screening or in evaluation of current employees. This type of testing technique asks the testee to perform tasks or activities that would be similar to tasks the employee performs on the job. The content validity is one aspect that makes this technique attractive to many evaluators, despite the disadvantages that are often associated with work sample tests. Designing an effective test could be a great investment for a company that is looking for a specific skill set to fill certain positions. Some researchers have found a positive correlation between work sample tests and job performance, but other researchers did not find quite the same results. When combined with other testing techniques, work sample tests can be a valuable tool in the employment selection process.